The standoff in Syria could quickly ignite into a larger conflict, and the war has already killed over 100,000 people and forced over 6 million from their homes. American and Russian warships are both in the region, and each nation is supporting opposing sides in the conflict. Russia's last foreign military base outside the former Soviet Union is located inside Syria's borders. Hezbollah and Iran are both threatening to attack Israel if the U.S. takes military action against Assad's government in Damascus. Members of al-Qaeda are known to be among the rebels being supported by the Obama administration. And like a Mexican standoff, the tragic conflict could go in any direction. Michael Scheuer, he's a historian and a former CIA analyst, and for 3 years he headed the Osama bin Laden tracking unit at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. He's the author of the book Imperial Hubris. In 2007, bin Laden said Scheuer's book revealed the reasons behind U.S. losses in the war on terrorism. Michael Scheuer is our guest today to provide insight and analysis into the crisis that is now growing in Syria. Welcome to WHDT, Michael.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for having me.
Now, Michael, President Obama just recently stated he wants to go into the conflict. He wants to use military force in Syria. He's also said he will be seeking congressional approval to do so. If that happens, who will our military be fighting? Who will they be fighting in Syria? Who are the rebels?
Well, if they're going to fight Assad, then they're going to fight in favor of a group of people who have been rebelling against Assad, but whose military power to oppose Assad comes strictly from al-Qaeda and other mujahideen who have come to the area since the war in Syria began. So, in essence, I think Mr. Kucinich said the other day the Air Force will be flying cover for al-Qaeda.
So to be absolutely clear, our military will be fighting alongside the mujahideen and al-Qaeda against a sovereign government in Syria.
Right. Our Air Force will be supporting the same people whose brethren killed between Iraq and Afghanistan about 9,000 American soldiers and Marines, yes.
And to provide some perspective, we did the same thing in Afghanistan when the Russians were fighting the Mujahideen. Is that correct?
In the sense that we helped lead the Russians there, absolutely. We had very little control over the Mujahideen, unfortunately, but they certainly did the job on the Russians.
Now, what role is al-Qaeda actually playing in the conflict?
The role they generally play, sir, al-Qaeda is an organization that's meant to support other people's insurgencies. They provide training, they provide weaponry, they provide most of all on-the-ground leadership, people who are experienced at the non-commissioned officer and field grade officer levels. And I think in this case, they're also bringing in more of their sort of infantry people because the resistance in Syria was very short of experienced military manpower. And so al-Qaeda and its allies, and I think it's important to stress the allies part of it. There are people coming from Somalia, there's people coming from Egypt. They're not all al-Qaeda, but al-Qaeda certainly is the core organizer of the military side of the resistance.
Now, what has been the role so far of the United States in this war?
Well, kind of sticking our nose where it doesn't belong, Gary, is what's happened so far. You know, if you step back and look at what's going on in Syria, everybody who America identifies as its enemies are killing each other at the moment. We dislike Syria, we dislike Iran, and we dislike Hezbollah. Al-Qaeda and the resistance are killing them. We dislike Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran are killing them. So in many ways, we have the best of all worlds in Syria, and now we're going to stick our nose in it to support people who will be far worse than Assad.
Now, some would say, let them kill each other if both of the sides are not friendly to the United States. Why is the United States insisting to stick our nose in the situation?
I think for a couple of reasons, mostly because we're owned by foreign governments. The reason that Obama delayed a week was to allow the Israeli lobby in this country to go around the country and lobby the congressmen. I don't think they can change the opinion of the American people in a week, but they have so much influence with the Congress because of campaign contributions, because of the threat of using the media against them, that they probably can swing a majority to vote in favor of the war. On the other side, the Saudis, who are highly invested in the United States economically, both in our debt and in property, have probably been ringing off the wall at various arms makers in the United States to order aircraft and other weaponry. And those arms makers, in turn, use their lobbyists to press the Congress. So between those two foreign interests who have ungodly influence with the government, they just might work a deal that makes the Congress support the president in this useless endeavor.
Well, we've seen that John McCain has come out and said that he will support the president in this action against Syria. However, troops on the ground are posting photographs of themselves holding signs over their faces in full uniform that says, "I will not fight alongside Al-Qaeda. I did not sign up to fight in a Syrian civil war." What does that tell you about the actual boots on the ground, the individual fighting man, the U.S. soldier?
I think in the big picture, Gary, it tells you that none of us matter. There's no one in the United States among the populace, whether it's foot soldiers or infantry or Marines or the average voter, who make any difference. The decisions are going to be made by these congressmen and the president and the people who pay them off. Saudis, Israelis, in the American Jewish community. That's where the decision is going to be made. And what's really shocking in what you just said about those soldiers is those soldiers have been led into 2 or 3 wars that neither George Bush nor Barack Obama had any intention of winning. We lost in Afghanistan. We should have never went to Iraq, but we lost there too. And now they're going to engage in a 3rd war and waste American money and American lives. So what it says is the Republic is in very big trouble, Gary, I think.
So you're saying the Israeli lobby is now actively lobbying Congress?
Absolutely they are. Look at McCain. McCain and Lindsey Graham are no more than shills for the Israelis. You remember how Graham tortured Hagel when he was being interviewed in the Congress for the defense secretaryship because he happened to say 1 or 2 things that weren't very friendly toward the Israelis. What we're seeing here is the giant American superpower being directed by Saudis and Israelis. That's what we're seeing.
Now, how will Al-Qaeda respond to a U.S. attack on Syria if we're supposedly fighting alongside them?
Well, I guess if you can do the happy dance in Islam, they'll be doing the happy dance. But Al-Qaeda is an old veteran group. They know that they have only one completely indispensable enemy or friend, ally, and that's the United States. And once again, Obama is going to prove that the United States is the greatest ally of Al-Qaeda in the movement it started.
Now, Michael, I want to ask you two questions. I want you to give us a best case scenario and a worst case scenario on this conflict.
Well, I think the best case would be if we didn't go. That would be the only best case. Everything is a degree of worse from there on out, sir. If we destroy Assad's army, for example, not only will Al-Qaeda come in and the Islamists come in and take over, but there'll be a tremendous slaughter in Syria. What the great humanitarians like Obama and Mrs. Clinton and the rest of them never talk about is that one of the reasons that the Assad government is resisting is not just because it's the government, but because they're of a religious sect that will be wiped out. There's over 1 million of them. And if they go down, there'll be a tremendous slaughter, which we will have been the authors of.
Now, if we actually strike against the Assad government, shouldn't an actual declaration of war be established if we're going against a sovereign entity?
Absolutely, sir. All the arguments they've made over the past, while that you don't need a declaration of war because you can't declare war against a group or a non-state entity go out the window. I think at the very least, Boehner and if the senator who's in charge of the Democrats, the guy from Nevada, have any real respect for the positions they hold, they'll demand that the president come before the Congress and ask for a declaration of war.
Now, a declaration of war, like you just mentioned, you can't declare war against an idea like terrorism or an action like terrorism. But what would that mean in the foreign policy spectrum that America is now declaring war? We haven't declared war since World War II.
Well, it would mean we're kind of edging back toward the Constitution, heaven forbid. You know, we're getting away from the idea that the president is a monarch, an absolute king who can take us to war whenever he pleases, and we also would negate the idea that the Congress can delegate a power that's only theirs, which is declaring war. See, the Congress does something so they can have it both ways. They pass this declaration that says we allow the president to use force. And then if he goes to war and he wins, they can claim credit. But if he goes to war and he loses or gets kicked, then they can say, well, they can sit on the sidelines and attack him. It's a cowardly business, and it's an unconstitutional business, Gary.
Michael, I want to talk about the Russians and their base there, but before we get to that, let's talk about those chemical weapons. Like I mentioned before, the BBC is reporting that those chemical weapons were in fact launched by the Assad regime. However, other reports are stating that they were actually launched from the rebels in an attempt to simply lure the United States into the conflict based on the president's line in the sand that he drew so many months ago. Who launched these this chemical attack?
You know, I really don't know, Gary. My own suspicion is it may have been Assad who did it, but the real question is, so what? This is a war that Assad is waging against people who started a war against the legitimate government of Syria. And at the end of the day, no matter how many people have been killed so far, not a single American has been killed, not a single American interest has been hurt, and very few American dollars have been wasted on this conflict. This is clearly a case of of self-determination, if you will. And if 100,000 dead people wasn't enough to justify an international intervention, certainly 1,400 dead because of a gas attack does not justify it either. I think it's a mountain. They're making a mountain out of a molehill here because they want to go to war against Syria because they're hoping Iran will come to Syria's defense and it will give them a chance to go to war against Iran.
Now, when the president says, or John McCain says, there are national security interests at stake here, what are they referring to?
Israel. Israel is the only possible reason. If we're so concerned that something is going to happen to Israel, we'll go to war for them. In fact, they'll bribe us to go to war for them or corrupt us to go to war for them. There is no U.S. national security problem here. In fact, we will have a national security problem if we attack Syria and degrade Assad to the point where his government falls. Because then our real enemy, the bigger enemy, which is the Sunni movement, not the Shias, will take over there.
Now, what about the Russians? They have a base there inside the Syrian borders. They've got ships in the region. What's their next move?
Well, I would think they've probably sent in a lot of anti-aircraft missiles, sophisticated missiles that we've never experienced before in combat situations. And probably trainers are already on the ground to help the Syrians learn how to use them. I don't think the Soviets want to fight with us or the Russians want to fight with us at the moment. And I think things will go so bad once we start this attack on Syria that the Russians will benefit from it in many ways, even if Assad goes down.
Now, what about the Iranians? What are they going to do in the event of an American attack on Syria?
That's a wild card, isn't it? The Iranians are a third-rate military who really pose no threat at all to the United States militarily. The threat to the United States comes from the fact that the FBI and the federal government have allowed the Iranians to establish a very large network of terrorist-capable men and women inside the United States over the past 20 years. By keeping the southern border open, by allowing them to concentrate in religious institutions which they then ignored. So the real danger here for the United States is not an attack by the Iranian military, but a widespread campaign of attacks inside the United States by operatives who have been here for years and who have taken advantage of this open southern border to get into our country.
So you're saying that there are Iranian sleeper cells inside the United States right now?
I think that minimizes it, Gary. I think it's a much bigger network. They established a network here in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, and in the Caribbean immediately after the revolution in 1979 in order to keep an eye on what the former Shah and his family and their supporters were up to. But once you build an intelligence network, you can use it for any purpose you want to use it for. And right now, we know Hezbollah has a wide organization in the United States, in places like New York, in Dearborn, Michigan, in Los Angeles, in Houston, and the Iranians have brought people in materials in over the southern border. So whether or not they trigger the use of that network, I think it's a much bigger thing than just calling it a few cells.
Okay, so if there's that large of a network already established here in the United States, if that group is activated, what would their purpose be?
Well, their purpose would be simply revenge. We've gotten used in the last 20 years, Gary, to attacking people who can't attack back. We attacked the Afghans; they couldn't hurt us. We attacked the Iraqis; they couldn't hurt us. The Iranians are a little bit different. They have a very strong sense of nationhood. They've been around for 2,000 years, and they're very willing to sacrifice themselves in defense of their country. And people say, well, most Iranians don't like the mullahs. With the Iranians, that may be true also, but once Iran is attacked, there's an enormous tide of nationalism. And of course, the people they've inserted into our country are not, I don't want to say fanatics, but they're true believers. And they're here for that specific reason, to give Iran an armed wing to respond against America if America attacks Iran.
Now, would members of that network also be American citizens?
Oh, I would not be surprised at all, sir, if they came here on green cards or they came here to be educated. That's just their job. That's just the way it works.
Well, in World War II, immediately after Pearl Harbor, Japanese American citizens were rounded up, placed into camps. After 9/11, we saw the individuals with ties to the Middle East. They were rounded up and they were put into camps as well. If this thing gets as large as it could, and there is some sort of fear of an Iranian reprisal here from that network, do you believe that we would see Iranian Americans rounded up and placed into detention centers as well?
I don't think initially. I think it would probably depend on how great the response was, and if there is a response. But I think that capability is there, Gary, and the president or no one ever talks about that. Attacking Iran will not be like attacking Afghanistan. It'll be a much different thing and a much more painful thing for the United States.
So if the United States needed to activate a detention center program in the event of a national emergency, they could do so and begin rounding up American citizens immediately?
I really don't know what the capacity is. I know they've been exercising a lot in the United States on different scenarios. I imagine they must be prepared for that. They know as well as you and I that they have 12 million people in this country they can't account for. They don't know who's here. So usually the government's pretty good at contingency planning, so they probably do have some kind of a plan to cope with people who they don't know, doing things they didn't expect.
Now, given the Iranian military chief stating that Israel will burn if America attacks Syria, and given the fact that the Israeli lobby has been lobbying congressmen to go into war in Syria, how is Israel likely to react in the face of attacks into Syria or Iran or Hezbollah?
Well, I think it's Hezbollah, and they're just using conventional weapons. There'll be a localized conflict. I would hope that the Iranians don't respond by trying to attack Israel, because then the whole system goes up. The whole Middle East probably goes up in flames. And of course, our Congress and our presidency is bought and paid for by Israel First. The American Jewish supporters of Israel in this country. So we'll be right in there with the Israelis if Iran attacks Israel.
Now, what out of this interview, what is the one thing you want the American people to take away in the face of this information and this pending threat?
There is no threat to the United States national security in what's going on in Syria. Absolutely none. Except if you believe that it is our duty eternally and forever to take care of Israel.
The standoff in Syria could quickly ignite into a larger conflict, and the war has already killed over 100,000 people and forced over 6 million from their homes. American and Russian warships are both in the region, and each nation is supporting opposing sides in the conflict. Russia's last foreign military base outside the former Soviet Union is located inside Syria's borders. Author of the book Imperial Hubris. In 2007, bin Laden said Scheuer's book revealed the reasons behind U.S. losses in the war on terrorism. Michael Scheuer is our guest today to provide insight and analysis into the crisis that is now growing in Syria. Welcome to WHDT, Michael.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for having me.
Now, Michael, President Obama just recently stated he wants Hezbollah and Iran are both threatening to attack Israel if the U.S. takes military action against Assad's government in Damascus. Members of al-Qaeda are known to be among the rebels being supported by the Obama administration. And like a Mexican standoff, the tragic conflict could go in any direction. Michael Scheuer, he's a historian and a former CIA analyst, and for 3 years he headed the Osama bin Laden tracking unit at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. He wants to go into the conflict. He wants to use military force in Syria. He's also said he will be seeking congressional approval to do so. If that happens, who will our military be fighting? Who will they be fighting in Syria? Who are the rebels?
Well, if they're going to fight Assad, then they're going to fight in favor of a group of people who have been rebelling against Assad, but whose military power to oppose Assad comes strictly from al-Qaeda and other mujahideen who have come to the area since the war in Syria began. So, in essence, I think Mr. Kucinich said the other day the Air Force will be flying cover for al-Qaeda.
So to be absolutely clear, our military will be fighting alongside the mujahideen and al-Qaeda against a sovereign